As we sometimes find ourselves doing on the channel, we're going to double down on Fox News liberal Jessica Tarlov today as she continuously, handles her MAGA co-hosts and their propaganda 4-on-1, this time in this video about Trump, January 6th, and crime. So let's line these up and knock them out one by one.
Time to play my favorite game, you cherry-picked. Okay, so what you didn't mention is that there was a downward revision in the level of violent crime in 2021 that was actually a bigger ratio than the upward revision in 2022. And 2021 and 2023 are actually lowest crime rates, violent crime rates that we've seen in decades.
Right.
I would also note that the homicide rate, which is pretty important, right? People getting murdered,
right,
that's unambiguously down, and you can check CDC stats against that as well. So David Muir has no apologies to give about
yes,
this.
He does. Because
no,
still,
he doesn't.
No, because
but
still the underlying issue of the FBI
down.
stats is that they didn't include, major cities. Yes, it is.
Okay, so there's a couple big facts I need to start by pointing out for context. The Crime Data Explorer, from which the UCR comes from, which is the Uniformed Crime Report, it covers 94% of the population. In metropolitan areas, or the big cities, the major cities, it's 98% coverage. So what he's saying about it leaving out big cities is flat out just a lie, right? The 6% not covered comes mostly from smaller rural areas where there's not police headquarters, there's not police stations that they can get this data from, which is how it's composed. They take the reports from the police stations, where anyway, in these smaller, rural, less densely populated areas, we know that there's less crime anyway. So it's a pretty accurate report. I'm sure that according to right-wingers, though, there's millions of crimes happening in that 6% not covered. In 2022, they were in the middle of changing their system, actually changing how they pulled this data to where they had even more population coverage. So small errors were to be expected. This was public knowledge as well. It's not something that was like hidden. And yes, they did update violent crimes to where there was a whopping 20,000 additional crimes in 2022. I know. So many. Oh, and 2021 was actually revised down by 56,000. So a much larger margin revised down than up. Both are still lower than the spike that Trump saw in 2020. But according to Fox, we're supposed to believe that this is like a big problem where crime has steadily been decreasing since Biden took office. From the high point that Trump saw in 2020, we've never reached that again under Biden. And 2023, with the new system fully implemented, 94% population coverage, 98% in metropolitan areas where we see the most crime. It's the lowest crime rate that we've seen in almost 50 years. So this is just a nothing burger.
He calls January 6th now a day of love. We should move on from January 6th to this was a day of love. And what I found perhaps the most interesting was that he kept saying we to encompass him and the insurrectionists. So now he's on that team.
They're not insurrectionists.
The tourists. The tourists with zip ties. He says we, and he's now called them hostages, which is a very strange...
Keep playing the Jan 6 card.
Okay, I will. But this came from someone who had supported him. This isn't about Jessica Tarlov hates Donald Trump.
Okay, so couple things again. January 6th was absolutely, unquestionably an insurrection, and it was the culmination of Trump's coup attempt against our government. January 6th, definitionally, right, of an insurrection is a violent uprising against the government or authority. January 6th was a violent mob uprising against the government to force them to go against the Constitution. They were literally violently breaking into the Capitol, assaulted police officers, and were looking for Mike Pence to seemingly violently force him to do what? To go against the Electoral Count Act, which is part of the Constitution. It's so cut and dry. The only people arguing this are those in the cult. And yeah, we will keep talking about January 6th happily, as long as the Republican Party is headed by the guy who literally oversaw this, who literally incited this to happen, who sent the mob there to pressure Mike Pence to go against the Constitution, where they then got violent, where he said things like fight like hell or you won't have a country. The guy who literally installed fake electors to try to subvert the votes of Americans, especially when he himself can't stop talking about the 2020 election, despite being the only person who tried to steal it. I mean, it's pretty asinine. And you no longer can call yourself the pro-law enforcement party anymore when your nominee is calling a day that resulted in the death of 3 officers shortly after, when hundreds of officers being injured, multiple officers resigning. I think it was like 3/5 of the officers injured were unable to return to duty. He calls that a day of love. So let's be so for real. There's no way that tests well outside of his base. This is Trump waving the white flag to moderates and independent moderates, right? Understanding that he has little chance to win anyone who's truly in the center over, at least in significant portions. And he's instead relying on his cult to come out in swaths and get him reelected, which in the past has proven to never be enough.